Andy, welcome. So happy to we're going to have you on the Built for Trust podcast. How you doing?
Very good. Thanks, Nick. Nice to see you.
Great to see you. So, actually, just a quick note for like audience. There's only a few people on the planet that I know of that, when they start really kind of getting into a conversation and discussion, I have to really think hard about what they're saying, and because it's they're they're thinking at a couple of levels above where I've normally been thinking, and that's Andy. So get ready for like a really great discussion. So Andy, all right. So first, I don't want to kind of dive into too deep, but you gave this really great keynote in New York in 2020, I think two it was, and we really didn't know what to expect, and it was really a brilliant conversation about your career. And so obviously I don't want you to take up all our time going through that. We have that like online, and people can take a look at that, and I encourage everyone to look at that. But you had this really wonderful journey in your career of both on the consumer side and on the supply side. And frankly, on the consumer side, I think you've been more successful than I'd say probably anybody else that I know that's been on the consumer side, in terms of how you've been able to work all across the stack and then utilize a lot of solutions that come from the vendor community to build value for the large organizations that you're working for. So why don't we talk a little bit about that journey, and I do have a couple of quick questions on it, or things I want to kind of amplify, but
Okay, sure.
how'd you get here?
Well, I think, I spent 10 years as a programmer, and I worked in the pharma industry, the oil industry, and the telecom industry. And I was, a good quantitative programmer. I liked writing code. I liked the challenge of solving business problems. And, you can scale yourself to a certain point, and then you can't scale yourself anymore. And, when I was at ICI and at Shell, I was working in teams of smart people solving hard problems. And Shell is really the place that I worked, which changed my perspective on what impact technology can have on companies. So between the five of us, basically built out an automation solution, which came from The Hague. It was like a Shell standard program, but the application of that program was done locally in the refinery that we worked in. And at the time I joined, the oil price had completely plummeted in 1986. And it was a survival discussion that we had with our refinery manager about whether we could automate fast enough for the refinery itself to survive. So it felt very immediate and urgent in terms of the outcome that we were trying to achieve. But it also had a huge human impact as well. So, the refinery went from 2,300 people to about 650 over about 18 months. And essentially, technology automated away the jobs that were eliminated. And once the technology had done that, it was impossible to go backwards. If the technology didn't work, things stopped working. Like, you couldn't blend works. And I think that was also a really eye-opening moment for me. I'd spent a lot of time growing up with adults. My parents would always have dinner parties, and I'd be arguing or debating with adults probably until late into the morning on Sunday mornings on many occasions. And I was used to operating at that level really from about age 13 or 14 onwards. And I felt like the people I worked with at Shell, many of whom I'm still friends with actually 30 years later, also understood the enormity of what we had done. In my case, what I did was, they wanted to make me a manager. They wanted me to go manage teams of people. And I was like 24 years old, and I wanted to write code. So I became a contractor, and I wrote code for another 6 years. I worked at BT most of that 6 years, and I worked at Marconi as well as a formal job. But informally, I was building all sorts of startups for all sorts of people, because it was the dawn of the PC. It was the automation of things like AMI Pro and technologies like that. And so it was a lot of fun. And I found you could do things with code that you couldn't do with vendor technology at that stage. So, BT, we were Oracle's biggest customer. We got to work with Oracle a lot, and we worked on some absolutely hairy problems with Oracle. I've patched many a database at block level in the middle of the night with a guy called Bob Dunsby, who was the guy at Oracle for that. And so BT was a fantastic learning experience. I mean, the scale of the problems was gigantic, honestly, bigger than anything I've ever had to work in financial services. And we used vendors to help us, but really, we were still writing the code. And by the time I left, I was an engineering advisor. I essentially had oversight over, a large number of programmers, and I would help them solve the hard problems. I would also teach them how to code, but not in a kind of learning, not in a classroom way, but actually hands-on, looking at the business problem they're trying to solve. What are the best algorithms you can use, and so on and so forth. And I realized when I was managing hundreds of people doing that there was nothing that I could do as a single contributor that would be bigger than that. You can't. And BT had a dual track career path. So you either went on the management track or the technical track. And although there was one job grade higher than mine on the tech track, I felt like I couldn't personally do more unless I went in and started to drive change on the other side, on the management track.
On the management.
Yeah. So when I went to Paribas in '94, I kind of looked at where to go very carefully. I was like, I didn't want to just pick another place to go. I'd spent 6 years at BT. I was pretty loyal, and I really enjoyed working there. But with Paribas, I mean, I was brought into this project, which was the first Windows NT trading floor rollout project in financial services. I didn't know that at the time, but I figured it might be true because the product hadn't even gone gold actually at the time I signed the deal there. So went in there and again saw that Windows NT on trading floors compared to Sonos was massively advantageous. I mean, you could build financial products in a day that other people were taking months. And in a market where opportunity opens up and then it closes fairly quickly. If you just think about interest rates, think about today. I mean, here we are sitting here this morning, and all of a sudden the consumer price index goes up a bit and the stock market plummets again. You often only have a very small window with an idea that you have to get it into the market. And that was something that we perfected, I think, at Paribas. And it gave me the insight to kind of think about what vendor technologies are clever enough that they can change the way you work. So Windows NT was clever, and 4 systems ATM, which we also deployed at Paribas, put 155 megabit into every desktop at a time when everyone else was running shared 10. I can't even tell you how much better it was. I mean, literally, we could save files faster on our network, on our compact 4500 network file share devices than you could save the same file to the C drive of your computer. And that is something you can't tell people. And by the way, if you're a trader, you're going to do whatever's easiest. So if it saves faster to the network, then you put it on the network. And then if the PC blows up, you haven't lost all of your model. So it was
I gotta stop you there for one second. So I have never heard an ATM good outcome story. That's the first time I ever heard one. So congratulations on that. You got like a 10x or 15x performance increase.
I omitted the part about LAN emulation and sleeping on the trading floor to get it working, but I'll take it. So anyway, everything inside ATM was great, but as soon as you went from ATM to Ethernet, that's when things got a bit tricky. So we put all of our servers on ATM as well, and then it was pure ATM, and everything was good. Anyway, we won't have an ATM discussion all day. So
no, it's okay. Yeah, right.
And then,
so
and then
go ahead.
From that point on, honestly, when in my corporate life, I was always looking for a technology that we could use that would be a 10x or 100x game changer in terms of something. Finding things in terms of anything that's a hard business problem, like our operations team takes 20 minutes to find the account they need to allocate to because they're going through green screens and trying to find the account. That's an example of a problem. And I loved problems like that, because if you could find a technology, and we found a technology called Fast, which ended up being acquired by Microsoft in the end, that allowed us to do that inside our enterprise systems very easily. And so I've always looked for what are those one or two things that you can bring in that would really dramatically change the business. And that goes back to my experience at Shell. Like, how do you change a business? You've got to do something at the next level of thinking from the level of thinking you were at when the current operating model and business model was built. And that's kind of the way I've operated.
Yeah. Yeah. Great lessons learned. Like, it's like early on kind of understanding how kind of utilizing kind of software and computer science to automate, to get these really huge advantages for a company, especially what was interesting about, the first story, is around kind of around the oil drilling platform is, man, that is such a high pressure situation when you're kind of in a contraction phase and you're having big reduction in forces and you have a lot more work requirement for a lot of people. And then you're actually now utilizing some software that you guys develop in order to kind of bridge that gap and to like normalize and get the business kind of righted. That's what an experience at an early age to have that, I'm sure that kind of colored a lot of your decisions as you kind of went forward. So it's
It really
like,
did. So, I mean, I've always thought, necessity is the mother of invention, and oftentimes in financial services, I mean, the boom bust cycle happens in 2 years, and so everything's great, it's all going well, it's .com 1.0, it's 1999, and here we are in 2000 or in 2001, and you've run 8 rounds of riffs in a year, right? And it's depressing running 8 rounds of reductions in force in before 9/11 that happened actually.
Right.
And so what you get used to is figuring out how you can keep things running at the same level that they're running at, take people out and not break anything. And this is like a very hard problem to solve. And many of my cadres who've worked in senior roles in financial services have had to deal with that. And oftentimes in financial services, you don't get the time to do the process automation before you take the people out. What they do is they take the people out and make you figure out how to do the process automation. And so oftentimes in big companies, like in the big tech companies that have downsized, reasonably significantly in the last couple of years, they haven't really hit the point yet where people are forced to innovate on the fly. You've got to come up with a way of not breaking the business. The most immediate experience that I have of that was in 9/11, where you've got 6 days to rebuild the entire business on the other side of the river with no access to that side of the river, and you've got to rebuild all the applications, you've got to get everything back up and running, and you've got six or 7 days. And I mean, working for Chris Corrado in that era and just working with a team that just would never say never. And you find out that without politics and without the kind of run-of-the-mill discussions that get in the way, they impede the implementation of projects, you can get things done ridiculously fast. Literally, we built 2 trains in 4 days with carpenters. I mean, it's just, you just got to think about how you get it done, not why you can't get it done. And you've got to allow for no time for people who are in the way of getting it done. And that's hard, right? Because in the world we're in right now, obviously taking people's feelings into consideration and all the rest of it is very, very important. And to be honest, I mean, when you're in a crisis, you just don't think that way. And I was talking to a very learned person who's got nothing to do with technology recently about something called crisis quotient, which I'd never really heard of before. So, everyone knows about IQ and EQ, but crisis quotient is something that I hadn't really studied actually before. But crisis quotient is your ability to understand in a crisis how to get to the goal and think clearly in a fairly clinical way to make sure that the people around you who maybe you're leading or maybe you're part of a team that's leading them feel like they're able to contribute, but the goal is something that's immutable. You have to get there. You have to figure it out. And so many of the downsizings we've seen recently have not caused that level of thinking to happen because they're so big, those organizations, they can absorb these kind of things without actually having to really dig in and find a way to do things. I remember Lou Gerstner came into Merrill Lynch right after Who Says Elephants Can't Dance was published.
Great book. I read that book.
Brilliant. And he talked about he talked to the top 250 people at Merrill, and he was talking to them about the fact that without a burning platform, you never make hard decisions. It's only when the platform's burning. And he's like, and you guys go through this boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. But you've never had to do what we had to do at IBM when Microsoft took our market cap, and we felt like we were losing our grip on the crown of technology. And so the services business was obviously the IGS, that whole chapter in IBM's history was Gerstner's approach. But I left the room thinking, yeah, you're right, actually, that really we've had crises, but we haven't had those kind of existential threat crises, really. And I never, so that was probably in, I don't know, 2002, I should think, maybe 03. But rolling the clock forward to 08, that was an existential crisis. That was like, then all
for
of a
sure.
It really is like, how can you just keep things running even though you're really cutting to the bone? So I do think that skill set, that whole idea of crisis quotient and almost interviewing for that, because you need a bit of that in your organization. It's part of how you create diversity, is super important.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like as you're talking, I'm thinking Apollo 13, and that kind of crisis, crisis management. I'm also thinking too, is that like when you have to cut so much where all of a sudden the workflow is broken, and how do you maintain quality? How do you maintain customer relationships? How do you maintain the business revenue, coming in? You're right. It's like a lot of like 10% reductions usually don't do that. Maybe 20, 30% reduction in forces. That's when they really start to impact. And thank God that we haven't had to go through that. But I have to say, it's like our generation, we didn't have to go through the things that I think my parents' generation went through with the Great Depression and World War II and, on its heels and so forth. That was amazing American hardship and amazing American grit that got that generation through that. But I think it's like, come on, it's like our, 2001 timeframe, the 9/11, hit, the 2008, hit. I think, we've had our shares of like, may you live in interesting times moments, over these last, couple of decades. Those were our challenges. And, and you're right. I think, to like making that a skill set, and to bake that into an organization of being ready for crisis, because it's so easy to kind of rest on laurels and think about growth planning until you can't, and then you have to kind of adjust the ship, So no, that's, but we're going to bring this conversation back, in a little bit when we start getting into the AI stuff. So I think one thing that a lot of folks would love to hear about is it's not just our industry, but it's all industries where there is a tendency to be all in and work all the time and be really focused on, either it's your career or the work that you're doing, and that your family life suffers. So, how have you managed like business and personal time and relationships going forward? Have you kind of found a way to make sure that your work is not dominating the attention that you needed to give to your kids when they were young and your spouse?
That's a pretty deep question. So thank you for that. Yeah. I think the bottom line on that is that you have to find time to do the things that are important for any people that you love, spouse, children, parents, whatever it is. And so being able to find the time is something that I think is super, super important. It's a very important skill. Time management is one of the most important skills. If you don't want people around you to feel like you're not giving them enough time, you're ignoring them, you're not interested enough or whatever. So I was not good at that, honestly, until probably my late 30s. And I worked with somebody at Merrill Lynch, and he gave me his way of managing it, which was interesting. He said, I have 2 color codes on my calendar, Andy, and one of the color codes represents 35% of the time, because I know something's going to come up and I'm going to need to change the things that I'm doing that week, that priority, maybe even that day. And I need to have meetings that I need to do but they can be moved. They're not time
Oh.
critical. So this 35-65 split, I learned from a very senior leader at Merrill. I started
Mm.
using myself. So I would have the calendar items actually color coded in a way so that my admin knew if something came up, you can move those meetings to another week, or I can just be
Mm.
excused. I don't have to go to those meetings. And so I think in a 90s, 2000s, 2010s culture, there was a propensity for too many meetings without enough
Mm.
purpose. And I feel
Yeah.
like to a certain extent that's got better. And it depends what company you're in, how big the company is, and all the rest of it. But I think managing your time so that you get out of life what you want is equally important to managing your time so that you give to others what they
Yeah.
want. The way I think about the hierarchy of need, if you like, for time management is the first thing is you need to spend enough time on yourself. And it sounds
Mm.
selfish to say that, but you actually do. If you're
Yeah.
living your life and you're not going for a bike ride and you're not going to the gym and you're just doing for others all the time, then what life are you having, right? So to me, I think managing your own time so that you get time to do the things that are valuable to you is
Mm.
super important.
Yeah.
Health is part of that. So managing your health and making sure you remain healthy is essential for your family. Because if you're not healthy, you sure as heck can't help them. So I think
Yeah.
that's super important too. And so with those two things managed properly as part of family life and making sure that you've got those things, the job should be the thing underneath that. The job is the thing that supports the family from a financial perspective to some extent, but the if you don't get those other two things right, you just won't have a happy life. And
Yeah.
again, I felt like in my late 30s, early 40s, I figured that out to some extent. But truthfully, I didn't really figure it out until I left investment banking. So in
Mm.
2013, when I founded Sandhill East, I decided any day I wanted to go for a bike ride, I was going to go for a bike ride. Any
Yeah.
day I wanted to go for a walk with my wife, with the dog, I would do that. And so I think, you have to come up as early as possible in your life with a strategy that works for you, and that strategy should always include enough things that you can do. It might just be meditation, might be swimming, might be going to the
Mm.
spa, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Things that allow you to relax so that you get enough downtime, stop you getting sick, basically. So I think that's
Yeah.
super important. So
Yeah.
there is a magic formula for this, and I think you learn much more as you get older. And many of the things as you get older, you wish you had known earlier, because then you would have maybe handled the situation differently. But as
Yeah.
Julius Caesar said, experience is the teacher of all things, and it's impossible to get the wisdom without living the life. So
Mm.
that's how I feel about it, honestly.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. I kind of think of it around kind of boundaries and putting in the boundaries that work for you. I had an epiphany back in 1998. So I've always I've worked for myself since 1991, and I started a company called Strategic Networks around that time, and I sold that to SoftBank in '97. And so I was traveling like for that decade. I would be in like 3 NFL cities a week, literally for a decade, and and I was just raising, a family with my wife. And so I had, my daughter was 4 at the time. And so I remember this day so vividly. It's like, um, I always get up a little bit earlier than everybody else. So I got up, but my daughter was also up, and she was like on the couch. So I go over and to sit next to her, and to say good morning. And she got up and she moved to the other couch because it dawned on me is that she didn't feel comfortable with me. I wasn't around enough, and that she didn't, um, not that she didn't trust me, but it's more like, um, she didn't know me, as good as she could. And that hurt like really deeply. And so, that was an epiphany, for me, and I totally changed, kind of my lifestyle, from that moment on, to make sure that, not traveling, anywhere near the way I was traveling. Make sure that I always have time for both, her and my son and my wife. And so there was a readjustment to the boundaries that I put in place, for that. But sometimes you need that kind of crisis moment, to recognize, Um, so that was the beginning of the month. Towards the end of the month, something similar happened, with her. Um, and so I didn't want to impose. So like she was sitting on one side of the couch. So I came in, I sat on the other side, and she got up and she sat next to me.
There you
And
go.
I thought, okay, that was that was a wonderful moment.
Great.
So anyway, I think these are important kind of discussions to have because um, life is really precious, and and when it all comes down to it, it's really all about your family, you and your family. So I want to shift. So thank you for entertaining that topic. So I want to talk a little bit about. I follow you on social, and I know that you've been posting about RFK. So I'm a supporter of RFK. I love his approach on a lot of different things. And I think internally, I'm a conservationist. I'm also somewhat of an environmentalist, although I'm kind of pro development and, as well, so I'm not sure kind of where I fall on that, that spectrum, but it's probably not all the way, towards pure conservationist and environmentalist. But I live in coastal regions, and so I'm always concerned about the ecosystems. I fish, I hunt, so I, care deeply about, the state of kind of the environment that we're living in. So I wanted to have a little discussion about that because I know that you've been, I think, brave, because like sometimes like politics is like the third rail, and because we have such a polarized um, nation, and in high tech too, we're pretty polarized as well when it comes to politics. So anyway, I've noticed you posting about RFK. So what's your view?
Well, I think every political system has its day, and I feel like JFK in particular was an absolutely phenomenal leader. Many of the inventions that we rely on today wouldn't have happened without the choosing to go to the moon. But it wasn't just that. I mean, you go listen to any of his speeches, and his speeches talk to people in the heart, and I feel like both political parties and what RFK calls the divide are present in our society and are actually dividing families, to your previous point. So,
Mm.
the 2016 election is a great example in, our extended family where the people who were likely to vote Republican, even if they didn't vote for Trump, were chastised and essentially it removed from conversation by people who were voting for Hillary. So I think that the human
Yeah.
impact of the polarization is extraordinarily negative within our society. I think it impacts the education system, the legal system, obviously the political system, and some of the decisions that are being made, even about war, are being made in the context of that polarized system rather than in the context of what's in the best interest of American citizens.
Yeah.
When you sit on a board, you're especially on a public board, you have a fiduciary duty to shareholders. And the same is true when you serve in Congress or the Senate or in the White House. I mean, your clients, your customers, are the people who elected you. And so I would like to see a lot more accountability to the people who put those people into those positions than we're currently seeing. And what I've seen with RFK's campaign is that he's campaigning with his heart, with his legacy, and with his history, which is a lot to carry.
Yeah.
And the reason why he's running is because he didn't like what he was seeing, and neither did I.
Mm.
So my point of view is there are many people in this country. More, in fact, the majority of people in this country now are independent, and
Yeah.
so what that usually means is which way I bend toward the election depends on which candidate is running for the party and which one I like the best. But this time around, there's actually an alternative. And
Yeah.
alternatives are dangerous in politics. I mean, if you
Mm.
look at this historically across many democracies in the world, when a third party emerges or a third candidate emerges, that has significant public support and is talking to the issues that the public care about, like healthcare, like the elimination of the middle class, like the ability for everyone to have the American dream, then all of a sudden, the polarization, which has caused the opposite to happen, it's increased the divide, it's increased the gap between rich and poor, start to reflect on whether that message is being heard much more loudly and much better than their own. So
Yeah.
I'm expecting that the attacks on RFK will increase dramatically. The more likely it looks that his candidacy is both real and able to actually secure the majority of the vote from the American public. So I think it would be unreasonable to expect that they're going to behave reasonably given the way they act towards each other. So that's kind of why I believe that it's time for a third force to emerge. And it's happened in other countries. Countries with proportional representation particularly have a large set of different representations that allow you to get much closer to the views of the actual people. And one other thing I would just add is, you know, when you take a manifesto and you think about what an individual candidate is going to deliver or not, it's just like a person. When you hire a person, you're hiring them with all their faults and all their weaknesses, as well as all their strengths and their capabilities. And you have to decide, is that package something I'm willing to sign up for? Now, with politics, for example, you know, there are many, many topics, and I'm not going to list them, but everyone knows what they are, where something that has nothing to do with politics, maybe even has more to do with religion, is now packaged into a left-wing or a right-wing view, and you have to pick which package you dislike the least. With RFK, that's not the way it's working. He's out talking to people about what they want and building an agenda around what those people want. And I feel like that is extremely healthy for the country. It's extremely healthy for democracy. And as I said, I think even if he doesn't win, hopefully some of the language of vitriol and attack will be replaced with language of one America, of a nation not divided, how we can work together to solve problems rather than the converse. So that's what I see is missing right now. And the thing that's causing that to be missing is the kind of leadership that JFK showed. JFK appealed to everybody in the country. Choosing to go to the moon appealed to everybody in the country. He certainly had his faults. You can read 100 books on those, but he was able to bring people together, right? So to me, if we had that, we would live we'd feel different about where we live. We would live in a different world than the one we're currently living in. And that's the world I want to live in. And that's the one I think RFK can deliver.
Yeah, no, I think that very well said, and also a really great perspective, you know, on that as well, and the divisions and the divisiveness, you know, that's out there. You know, it's odd. It seems like it kind of lives in places like on cable TV news and somewhat on social, but like on public, when I'm with friends that are on both sides of the spectrum, they never. And I can say I never lost a friend, you know, or a family member, you know, because of political differences. That's anomalistic. I know that's been systemic. A lot of people, you know, have. But I think that's really a great quality, you know, of you know, RFK, you know, where he isn't that divisive personality. And I also love the way that he's, you know, he'll take issues that maybe were normally you would think are kind of like on a left or a right side, and those lines I don't see him drawing. You know, it's like, you know, his lines are kind of just reality, what's right and what's wrong, you know, and so I find that really refreshing. You know,
I totally agree. So, I mean, having watched the work he's done at Riverkeeper, you know, I've been to the Riverkeepers ball a few times over the last 20 years and seen him speak a number of times. When you look at what he's done, he isn't personally accountable for this, but he has had more impact on the improvement in the water quality of the Hudson River, and by setting an example than any other person, and by setting an example, you know, waterkeeper.org wouldn't exist if riverkeeper.org hadn't been successful. And Waterkeeper is now looking after 2,000 rivers worldwide or more. So don't quote me on the number, I might have that wrong, but the thing is that by setting an example, you can drive change toward good. And he spent a lot of his life doing that. and he sued major corporations and won on many, many subjects.
Yeah.
Most other attorneys even wouldn't take that on. And so,
Yeah.
again, the way I think about it is you shouldn't judge people by what they say. You should judge people by what they do, right?
Mm.
The guy was on heroin, right? He became an addict. He
Yeah.
knows that there's a day where he decided, I'm not going to be an addict anymore. And he tells
Yeah.
that story, honest about that. Other
Yeah.
people will try to cover that up. And so, again, no one's perfect, but my point of view is that if you take him versus either of the two likely candidates that he will be up against, he has a story to tell that I think will appeal to many of the American people. And he's not attacking his competitors. They are
Yeah.
attacking him, and they're mainly attacking each other, which may end up
Yeah.
being good for him. And this is the thing that I think, if you're on the left, you read left newspapers and you see left news. If you're on the right, you do the exact same thing for the right-leaning news media or whatever. But I believe that less than 20% of the country is actually on the left and the right in those terms. I believe
Yeah.
most people want a great place to live, a great place to raise children, a great education system, right?
Yeah.
And so I just think there's a gap between politicians' understanding of what the electorate wants and what the electorate wants, and that I think is his opportunity.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, I'm kind of connecting two dots over here, but then, it's like the discussion that we were having before, about when 9/11 happened, and then you had to kind of just move everything over to the Hudson River, and there was like this American grit, like, this has to get done. There's nothing that's going to stop this, from getting done. I think that's a uniquely American experience, and it was just, and I'm sure, like, whoever was like on those teams, they might have had different kind of political views, but it didn't matter at that time. It really all mattered is that, you needed to respond to a crisis, and you all did. And I thought that was a fantastic story that kind of tied into, our RFK discussion. So,
obviously, as a Brit, I would have to tell you that the Battle of Britain is one of those events as well. And both my grandfathers fought in World War II. So I'm not going to sit here and allow America to take all of the glory for that. But I think the thing that we have in common is that we want to see the right thing happen in the world. And I think the reason why we're such good allies is that reason. So I personally think that both political systems, actually in the UK and the US, need a force to emerge, which is much more representative of the people's view. And personally, I would spend a lot of time on that to make that happen.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I want to tie two other dots together as well. So one, early on in your career, you were talking about, like, the power of software and the automation, and to be able to kind of close big gaps in kind of a change of a business, or the opportunity that when something happens, a window opens in a short amount of time for you able to kind of respond to that real quick. We're moving into this AI world, and you and also Phil have been just fantastic in working with us on creating. Essentially, we're rewiring ONUG, to be the AI networking summit. So there's something, and I think you were just so unique in this conversation. There's, as we've been diving into this, what we've also kind of started to uncover is that CEOs are now starting to appoint chief AI officers, and that could be either a positive or a negative. So on the negative side of it, the concern that I'm starting to see is that, okay, well, if you're not really putting in good guardrails around how this this technology will be utilized on the brand, are you opening up risks to the brand that you might not be able to address very quickly? So is there a kind of a risk component associated with a kind of skunkworks kind of group that can move really quick, make some big changes, and that might also have a real negative impact on the brand, even though that's clearly not the intent, but that could happen. On the other side, of it too, is that there's a school of thought, and I'm not sure how big that school is, whether it's 2 fish or like if it's like 1 million fish, but it's like, okay, well, the CEOs have. If they're in a position where they've always viewed IT as an expense, they may view kind of AI, they might buy into like this whole argument that AI is going to be this amazing automation and efficiency engine where I can actually drastically reduce that cost. And there's that thought out there. There's a lot of people that's thinking that. So this AI organization is also being viewed as a competitive force to the existing AI structure. So, and it's kind of being called now, I think, shadow AI. So I don't know, any thoughts on, we're in the really beginning of this kind of phase on how we're organizing internally within corporations to kind of harness the power of this technology.
So I think the first thing to say is that, and we obviously spoke about this at the ONUG summit, but AI itself has been around a long time. The first time I worked with AI was in 1992 with inference systems. And so the approach of using a programming language that gives AI-like capability that makes it feel like it's the job of a human, but it's actually being done by a computer is not new, right? So the thing that's new is the scale and the power of the AI platforms that we have with LLMs, with causal AI, and so on.
Yeah.
With any company, if you sit down with the CEO of any company, and I've worked with many of them, not one-on-one, but pretty much. I'm going to have one-on-ones with a number of them, especially since I started Sandhill East. What I find is that the first question is the most important question, and that question is, do you want to do something, or do you want to do nothing? And is that a higher risk doing nothing or doing something? And I think with many new technologies at the bleeding edge stage of a technology, most people would rather do nothing in big companies. They know that smaller companies are going to be able to exploit this technology and potentially revolutionize the way something works. Right. But they're prepared to take that risk because they've got enough capital that they can go buy that company if they need to. Right. So the first question is always, do you want to do something? Now, with this generation of AI, since really ChatGPT came out, the common understanding of the capability of this technology became very, very rapidly absorbed by consumers.
Right.
It wasn't by companies. Consumers using ChatGPT were able to act like superhumans and do things they couldn't do before. It changed the way students do homework. It changed the way people figured out what stocks to buy with a multiple of less than 17x and all of a sudden here's your answer. So for consumer use, this technology has proved itself already, which kind of forces the enterprise to engage. So doing nothing becomes a higher risk than doing something. So once you're at that point and you're a senior executive in a large company, let's say you're the CEO for the sake of this discussion, you've got to figure out what you can do that's not going to put your brand at risk. So you didn't use the word unintended consequences, but there are certainly unintended consequences around hallucination, around not having the right entitlements on your data before you let this technology loose, and so on and so forth. Now, if you go back and think about how those problems are solved in a non-AI world, you have something called an information security and policy manual, and that determines how you're authenticated, what are the coarse-grained entitlements that you have, which are essentially which applications you're allowed to access. The third one is fine-grained entitlements, which is looking at within each application, what are you allowed to do? Yeah, you can log on to the system that allows you to do wires, but can you send wires of any amount? Can you send to anybody you want? Et cetera, et cetera. So control frameworks come from all of that infrastructure. Now, the CEO that wants to do something generally starts off with, how do I make it safe enough and give it to people that are smart enough? I don't have to worry so much about this. So the control framework, which is largely about entitlement management. So it's about who has access to information and what information do they have access to. And the who in this case might not be the person. It might be the LLM that's running on-prem or in the cloud or in a VPC that's now indexing or spidering all of that content and is able then to provide an answer to somebody. So with many, I mean, as a person who's deployed bleeding edge technology many times into large banks, If you don't understand the control framework, you can be out of work pretty quickly, to be honest. So you've got
Yeah.
to understand the control framework. Now, the head of AI role, by definition, is actually a hard role to succeed in, because what power do you have? How much budget do you have? Do you have the businesses behind you? Do you even have the business domain experience to figure out where to apply AI in this business domain to get the biggest bang for the buck? And you know, if you watched that video with Elon where he's talking about his philosophy on hiring engineers, and he wants to hire engineers that ask the question, why does that process exist? Because maybe it doesn't need to exist. And the fewer processes that we have, the easier it is to automate them. And as a Tesla driver, I see that thinking in everything in the car. I mean, it's literally it's in the way he builds and thinks about things. You don't have to do everything in a massively process-rich way. It's okay to do it in a way that works, you know?
Yeah.
So I think the smart organizations are, first of all, taking this risk-based approach with governance being built in. And second of all, they're picking the use cases with the really biggest bang for the buck. And so the kind of things we've seen that are interesting are developer automation and developer acceleration. So using Copilot in development is something where many companies have seen massive productivity improvements.
Yeah.
Taking the work of business analysts, financial analysts, research analysts, where a lot of the work is pulling data from various different places, bringing that data together. Again, you look at those processes, sometimes they could be 80% faster. I've seen examples at 380%. So that's pretty phenomenal, right?
That's totally phenomenal. Yeah.
Being able to do things a lot quicker with a reasonable level of quality is great. But the challenge you have with that is that the people doing that are young. So those roles, business analysts, research analysts, finance analysts, they're young people. They don't have the experience to look at something that seems completely credible and go, well, hang on a second, that doesn't make sense, because, right? And so the role of a manager, the person with the experience, to the conversation we talked earlier about Caesar, is now to coach people. How do you find the anomalies in something that looks completely credible because it's built by something that's using past data and past spreadsheets to build something that looks completely credible, but actually has 3 flaws in it around, let's say, how discounted cash flow has been calculated, for example, right? So very important to keep experienced people involved in the process and use them to teach people who are doing the work how to look for the challenges there. Now, if you think about that, the most experienced people, the people who are both close to the coalface but have been doing it for a long time, become the most valuable. And in that example I gave, it's possible that middle management is not that valuable because they don't have enough experience and they're not close enough to the coalface. So you can start to see where AI works from an augmentation point of view, and we'll talk about replacement in a second. But where AI works from an augmentation point of view, unless unless the people who are managing the analysts do have enough experience or are able to upskill themselves so that they can actually look at models and do that kind of analysis, it's going to be hard to keep those people employed. So I think by definition, if the intelligence is now coming from the AI to at least put the initial thinking together, and you're able to train it on data that has best in class use cases of things that you've done before inside your company, then all of a sudden the role of the middle manager becomes a lot trickier to define in terms of making it really useful. And probably the number of people that you're responsible for increases pretty significantly because you want the people to be empowered and be able to work on the actual problems that are being set in their own right as much as possible. So that's the first thing. That was a long answer. Sorry, I need to pause for breath.
No, those are really, really important. You're right. Like making sure that there's like a great control plane and a control guidance and guidelines, you know, around the kind of the use of any kind of technology that protects the brand. Like obviously that's, you know, that's really, you know, great. Being, you know, as an engineer, you should always be as close to the product as possible, or a financial analyst or what have you. And so that's interesting. So if you actually live by that guideline in driving your own career, then this should really be extremely helpful. If not, then it's interesting. You're kind of like just saying like there, and I can see this like kind of the middle management role may become less than over time. Where kind of AI is kind of replacing a lot of that functionality or that the skill set that the middle manager was providing, and really enhancing both the developer and the developer delivery. And it also makes a lot of sense that, that it doesn't make sense. AI maybe for lifecycle management within IT makes an awful lot of sense, but for really kind of new product development, it doesn't, right? So I think all of that has strong ring of truth, to it.
Yeah. So I mean, even for new product development, I think being able to improve the productivity of the people building new products is very important. So that kind of AI will still be very useful, I think. But let's talk about a use of AI, which is starting to become more prevalent. So the idea of creating workers, AI workers that can do something like a task or set of tasks more efficiently than a human has been around for a long time. There are many sci-fi movies with things like that in. But we're working with a company called WorkFusion that has done that. So they for compliance and regulatory workers, they now have 8 to 10 workers and an SDK where you can build your own workers that do various different things. So, adverse media screening analyst is an example of a role that you can buy from WorkFusion, where you can literally plug the person in as if they were a member of the workforce, and they will do the job of the adverse media screening analyst, and they won't miss anything because, they're a computer and they don't miss things, they don't drop things. So in some companies where they've adopted this technology at scale, I mean, they're seeing a 50% reduction in the number of people that they need to do certain tasks. And so, any task that is repetitive and automatable falls into that category, essentially. So I think we're going to see more and more of those replacement technologies as well. And the impact of those, both added to what we talked about previously as well, and even for the people who are using the AI technology, they need to be upskilled and reskilled in capabilities that make them useful to the workforce. And in my opinion, this is now the job of the chief human resources officer and the CEO, and often the COO as well, is figuring out what skills are going to be most useful 2 to 3 years out. And how do we encourage and incent our employees to start learning about how to transition into those skills? And it could be training courses, could be taking a horizontal job move that allows you to move into something where your skills would be extraordinarily useful and can be leveraged into a future state career that is different than the path you're currently on. So I think reskilling becomes something that you have to do. And I mean, when I'm talking to my own kids, I mean, I have 5 children, and I've told all of them, you can't rely on the skills you have keeping you employed for more than 5 years at a time. You should always be thinking, where's the puck moving, and how do I move my own knowledge, my own experience, my own training toward the place where it looks like the puck is moving, and be prepared to adapt. You might be wrong. It might be that you thought it was going in a particular direction, now it's going a different way. So I think that if you compare the thinking of our fathers, where you find a great job in a great company, you're loyal to that company, they reward you, that whole ethos of the silent generation, and probably the generation after that too. And now in our lives, maybe it's been 7 or 8 companies for 4 or 5 years at a time on average, and so on and so on. And now it's become something where I think the role that you're performing right now in company X might not even exist in 2 years' time. And therefore, what do you need to do to drive your own career path towards an outcome that you love? And so that's one of the reasons I'm on the board of Skyhive. That's one of the reasons why we're trying to drive this, into the industry. The thinking that reskilling is at the core of where loyalty is going to be. Brands and companies need to invest in reskilling in order for their workers to feel like they've been invested in terms of their own future, because doing the same job may not be an outcome that exists.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking with Gene Sun over at FedEx don't know, a couple of weeks ago, and Gene basically said he would summarize everything that you just said, Andy, into like this. He's like, AI is not going to take your job. People with AI skills are going to take your job.
Yeah.
So it's really all about upskilling yourself and understanding what are the tools that you need to be proficient in and how to utilize them all. It's interesting. Chris Moretti was also talking about his experience over at GE over years, and Jack Walsh always had the saying is that you should be always trying to strive to work yourself out of a job,
Sure.
meaning that that job will be over, and so if you have these mentalities, then you're right. You'll do well. I think that whole ethos of like working for a company that would take care of you, for your career. I think that's been gone for a long time. I think I haven't seen it that much in my own career, which spans now almost 40 years. So, but I think the acceleration is there. I think that's really the point.
Yeah, I mean, there are industries where you see very long tenure still. Insurance is an example, and I think there are many industries that haven't been really disrupted by technology, but I think AI is going to disrupt even those sleepier industries.
Good point.
So I think the thing that's different about this technology wave versus any of the others in our lifetime is that all of the others have always driven more automation, more efficiency, more effectiveness, and so on. But they haven't really gone after replacing the roles that humans perform. And I mean, they have. I mean, I gave you an example from Shell where but those people were probably all re-employed. I'm sure they were. And so this time around, I think it's different. I think that the knowledge workers that are being displaced, this hasn't happened to knowledge workers so much before. I mean, it's happened to a lot of blue collar industries. So I think it's a skill as a blue collar worker that you've had to learn to adapt maybe for the last 40 years, to your point, right? But as for knowledge workers, this really hasn't happened at the scale we're about to see it happen over the next 2 to 3 years. And there's a huge role for government to play here. I mean, governments need to be actively involved in the conversation with the C-suite and making sure that the training and opportunities that are given don't end up falling back on the state because the people are put out of work before they even have the chance to reskill. So I think there's a real conversation that needs to happen there between government and large corporations.
Wow. Yeah, that's actually that's a little scary. Just in terms of that wave that's coming to hit everyone. But I think I don't want to end on that note because that's not a really high positive note to end on. So we need one other topic, but we only have a few minutes. So maybe Andy, one thing, the promise. So we're focused on the whole AI networking and how network and security. AI promises to change that. So do you got a vision on how we might be able to operationalize, this infrastructure going forward, if AI is able to take a lot of the toil that's now associated with running that infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. So when you think about running a network, keeping it available as close to 100% as you can, there is a real skill to doing that. But many of the remediation techniques are fairly repetitive. Now, if you think about the whole idea of an autonomous network that is self-healing, we've heard that A, B, or C technology is going to do that since the 80s, right?
Right, for sure.
It's never really happened. And the reason why it hasn't happened is because you need too much cognition about everything that's going on before you could actually build that kind of technology, because it might get it wrong. And if it gets it wrong, it might make it even worse. Yeah. So you go back to Kevin Kelly's Out of Control book and you say, in order to do complex things, you need to do simple things well. And I think AI in network management and in network configuration will start off by doing simple things well, and will get cleverer and cleverer over time. Now, it turns out that if you can do simple things well and you can start to orchestrate together those simple things, then you can start doing more complex things. And I think that's the way we're going to see this evolve. So I can imagine provisioning of networks, particularly virtual networks, being almost completely automated. You can imagine not just networks, but actually entire AI stacks, if you like, being provisioned in a completely automated manner. But then managing those, looking at how they're communicating and so on, logging on and doing a net stat minus n or whatever and starting to understand how things work. A computer doesn't need to do that. A computer can actually figure that out very, very quickly. So I think there's a whole level of understanding, if you like, of how the network is working that has always been the domain of humans that can now become the domain of autonomous networks. And so it's very exciting in a way. I mean, this capability to really understand, to properly cognify what's going on and take corrective action. And again, it's going to start off with things that are simple. Circuit down, what do I do, right? And then it's going to get more complicated, right? Routing tables and how do you reroute traffic and cost and all of these things that people who've worked in networks for a while talk about. So I'm very optimistic about this, because in many of the situations that I've worked in, you have to be methodical and you have to be logical to solve really hard problems, whether it's a virus on the network or whether it's some other persistent network problem. But with much better information, and potentially with shared information between carriers and enterprises, that's when things start to get really interesting. So I'm massively optimistic about that. I think there's really good evidence that companies that have built networks on top of other networks have been much, much more able to get to very high availability numbers, reliability numbers, and scalability numbers, because they don't have reliance on any single underlying capability. So look at a Zscaler, look at a Radiance, any of these companies that have built on top have basically been able to build a better SLA because they're not dependent on any underlying technology vendor. So you take that up a level to say, how would you build an AI network? How would you start off doing that, right? It's a really interesting question. You'd start off by, circuits are pretty commodity, so you could bring circuits together. And now you start to think about how could you apply AI to get into the highest possible availability for your new network that you just built. So that's where I think a lot of thinking is going to go. I think a lot of people are thinking about this. They're thinking about branch connectivity. How do I make sure that always stays up? Every little bit of the network, I think people will be going after this autonomous capability. So it's super exciting, and I think doable by 2030 for sure.
Wow. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Andy, this has been like so much fun. Yeah. Thanks so much for taking the time, and coming on. Always a pleasure to chat with you, as well. So thank you.
Well, I think it's the first podcast where I've been able to talk about my family, RFK Jr. and AI Network all in the same podcast. So I thank you for the broad canvas, and I really enjoyed my time with you as always. So I'll look forward to spending more time together later in the year.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Andy. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for plugging in.